forest was thick with the scent of pine, and a crisp chill hung in the air. Stephen packed up his gear for another solo hunting trip. It had been years since he'd ventured this far into the woods. He'd heard stories of strange occurrences that kept people away. But Stephen wasn't afraid of the dark or the unknown. He had hunted these woods before, and the rumors only made it more thrilling. His truck rumbled down a narrow gravel road into the wilderness. The air grew heavier as he drove deeper into the forest. The trees loomed larger, their twisted branches bending over the road like arms reaching for something just out of sight. Stephen wasn't the type to get spooked by a bit of nature, but the eerie quiet was unsettling. No birds chirped, no animals scurried through the underbrush. He parked at the edge of a clearing near an old hunting cabin. The place had an almost nostalgic charm. He pulled out his hunting weapon, checked his gear, and set up his tent as dusk began to fall. The first night passed quietly enough. The crackling fire in front of the cabin kept the shadows at bay. Stephen found peace in the familiar rhythm of nature. His mind wandered as the fire burned low, but just before sleep overtook him, he swore he heard something, a sound beyond the usual nocturnal noises. It was a low, scraping noise, almost like something dragging across the forest floor. He brushed it off, telling himself it was just an animal, but the noise lingered like a distant whisper carried on the wind. The following morning, Stephen awoke early. His breath was visible in the cold, crisp air. He hadn't slept well, the strange dragging noise still echoing faintly in his mind. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a dim, golden light over the forest. But it did little to alleviate the oppressive silence that hung in the air. There were no birds, no squirrels skittering up the trees, not even the distant howl of a wolf. Just silence. He shrugged it off, telling himself it was just a lull in the usual sounds of the forest. He'd hunted here before. This place was always quiet in the morning, the animals just waking up and getting settled. But today felt different. Stephen made his way to the clearing where he'd set up his hunting spot. The path was well worn, familiar. As he approached the spot, he paused, feeling an odd unease creeping up his spine. It wasn't just the quiet, it was something deeper, something that seemed to weigh down the air itself. He set up his hunting weapon and began to wait, the minutes stretching into an endless series of tick-tocks that only deepened his discomfort. The trees around him stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like claws in the half-light. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning for any movement, but there was nothing. No rustle of leaves, no movement in the underbrush, no footprints in the dirt. It was as though the entire forest had frozen, suspended in a moment of eerie, unnatural stillness. A few hours passed, and Stephen's frustration began to mount. He had come out here for a purpose, not to sit around in the silence. He was a hunter, not a sitter. He rose to stretch his stiff legs, but as he did, something caught his attention in the distance. Just a flicker of movement through the trees. His pulse quickened. He raised his hunting weapon, eyes narrowing as he focused on the figure that had appeared between the trunks of the trees. It was too far away for him to make out any details, but was it a person? He squinted, feeling a shiver creep up his back. The figure moved again, but it didn't move like a person. It glided between the trees, barely making a sound, like something other. The figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving Stephen standing in stunned silence. His heart was racing now, and his hand trembled slightly as he lowered the hunting weapon. He told himself it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, just the wind, or maybe a deer moving in the distance. But deep down, a gnawing feeling told him otherwise. The sun sank lower in the sky, and the forest began to grow darker, its shadows creeping closer with each passing moment. Stephen returned to camp, his thoughts restless and uneasy. He hadn't seen or heard anything else, but the image of the figure in the trees lingered in his mind, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. As the night closed in, he started a fire outside the cabin, the flames crackling brightly against the oppressive dark. The fire offered warmth, but little comfort. The shadows around him seemed to grow longer with every passing moment, stretching out toward him as if they had a mind of their own. The silence was suffocating. It wasn't the usual stillness of the night, where the world was simply asleep. It felt more like something had deliberately cut off every noise, as though the very forest itself was holding its breath. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows around the camp, and Stephen had to force himself to focus on the task at hand. He set up his small stove, heated some canned beans, and tried to shake the growing sense of dread that clung to him. His movements were mechanical, like he was acting on instinct rather than thought. Every time he glanced up from his work, the trees seemed to press in on him, their dark trunks looming like sentinels, watching. There was something wrong in the woods, something that didn't belong. His instincts, honed through years of hunting and survival, were telling him that something was off. He should have left. The idea flickered across his mind, but his pride held him there. This was his trip. He wasn't going to be chased off by a feeling. Still, as the hours passed and the darkness deepened, the sounds of the forest remained absent. The wind hadn't stirred all day, and there was no rustling in the leaves, no cries of nocturnal animals. It felt like the entire forest was waiting for something to happen. Then, just as Stephen was finishing his meal, a soft, scraping noise echoed through the woods. His head snapped up, his heart pounding in his chest. The noise was faint at first, distant. He strained to hear it again, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. It came again, a slow, deliberate dragging sound, as though something heavy was being pulled along the forest floor. This time it was closer, much closer. He stood, hunting weapon in hand, every muscle in his body tensed. His eyes darted around the clearing, scanning for any sign of movement. The fire flickered, casting long, jittery shadows around the perimeter. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. An animal, perhaps, or even another hunter. But what he wasn't prepared for was the sudden silence that followed. The noise stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the echo of its absence in the air. His heart thudded in his chest as he waited. The tension in the air almost unbearable. Minutes passed, but nothing moved. What in the world was that? Stephen slowly crouched down, scanning the underbrush. Every sound felt amplified in the silence. His own breath, the crackling of the fire, the faint snap of a twig in the distance. Then, through the trees, a figure appeared. It was hard to make out at first. Just a vague shape moving between the trunks, too tall, too thin to be anything he recognized. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a creature he knew. His hand trembled as he raised the hunting weapon, aiming it toward the figure. It moved closer, gliding rather than walking. Its limbs stretched unnaturally like they were too long for its body, the silhouette swaying with a grotesque fluidity. The figure stopped just at the edge of the trees, its head turning slowly to face him. The air grew colder, the hairs on Stephen's arms standing up as he realized something terrifying. It was looking right at him. Stephen's heart hammered in his chest as the figure stood motionless, its hollow form barely distinguishable against the dark backdrop of trees. It was almost as if the shadows themselves had taken shape and come to life. He could see no eyes, no features, just an elongated shape in the darkness that seemed to bend the very air around it. The forest was utterly still, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. He should have fired. The rational part of his mind screamed him to take the shot, to aim, and pull the trigger, to protect himself. But something stopped him. It was as if the very air had thickened around him, heavy with dread, preventing him from moving. His grip tightened on the hunting weapon, but his hands were trembling, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, and for a moment, Stephen wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe the isolation had started to get to him. But then he saw it. The faintest shimmer of movement, just a twitch in the air, as if the figure had become a distortion in the space around it. And then, the sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum like the vibration of something deep within the earth. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, sinking into Stephen's bones, rattling him to his core. His skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The figure's form seemed to shift slightly, as though it was testing the space it occupied, like a predator sizing up its prey. Without warning, the figure moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast, too fluid to be anything human. It darted between the trees, its limbs stretching unnaturally, making no sound as it glided through the woods. Stephen barely had time to react, his heart racing as the creature disappeared into the shadows. The air felt colder, sharper, as though the forest itself had turned against him. His breath was ragged now, his chest tight with panic. The hunting weapon felt heavier in his hands, and he lowered it slowly, his thoughts whirling. He had to be losing his mind. It had to be some kind of hallucination, some product of the isolation, the long days spent alone in the woods. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The thing wasn't a figment of his imagination. It was real. He stumbled back to the cabin, his legs unsteady, and collapsed onto the porch, his mind ready seen. What had just happened? The sun had long since disappeared, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the forest. The silence was unbearable now, oppressive, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes watching from the trees. He tried to steady his breathing, but his pulse thudded in his ears, drowning out everything else. He grabbed his flashlight and scanned the perimeter of the cabin, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of the creature. The woods were still. Too still. It was like the entire world had fallen into a deep, unnatural slumber. But Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The next morning, Stephen woke with the dawn, but the unsettling memory of the figure still clung to him like a shadow. He barely slept. His dreams had been twisted, filled with images of the forest, the figure moving through the trees, its eyes. No, its absence of eyes, staring at him from the darkness. The forest felt different now. It was no longer just a place to hunt. It felt like something else entirely, a living, breathing entity with its own desires, its own rules. The trees seemed to whisper to each other, the wind stirring the leaves in a strange, deliberate pattern. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against him. Stephen tried to shake off the fear, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But the feeling of being watched never left him. He packed up his hunting gear and decided to leave the cabin, hoping to find normalcy deeper in the forest. As he walked further into the woods, the silence became oppressive. The air grew thick, like the forest was closing in on him. His every step echoed too loud in the stillness. The trees blocked out the sun, casting everything in an eerie twilight. And then he heard it again. The dragging sound, it was faint at first, but grew louder, closer. The unmistakable noise of something being dragged through the underbrush. Stephen froze, his heart racing. He turned slowly, feeling a chill run down his neck. The trees were still, the forest quiet, except for the scraping noise. The sound was coming from behind him, from deeper in the woods. The growl grew louder, closer. A chill ran through Stephen's veins. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. A chill ran through Stephen's veins as the growl grew louder, closer. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His mind was paralyzed, trapped in a state of fear and disbelief. The creature had found him. No, not just the creature. And then there was a voice. It wasn't human. It was low, guttural, yet familiar. Something tugged at the edges of Stephen's memory. The voice whispered his name. Stephen. He spun around, his hunting weapon raised, but there was nothing. The whisper echoed in his ears, growing louder with each second. Stephen. His mind was spinning. He had to get out of there. But the moment he turned to flee, the ground beneath him shifted. And then the sky went dark. The sun disappeared behind clouds that rolled in like they were summoned by a dark force. The forest darkened fast, shadows stretching long and thin. Stephen stumbled back, heart pounding, sweat dripping down his brow. His feet sank into the earth with every step. The soil was soft and unstable, like it was trying to swallow him whole. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. The growl was louder now, more distinct. It was closer, so close he could feel the vibrations in his bones. The voice. No, the voices continued to whisper his name. Stephen. There were more now, countless whispers echoing from all directions. The air felt thick, suffocating, like it was closing in, tightening like a noose. Stephen's mind reeled, his thoughts a blur of panic and confusion. He had to escape. But where could he go? The forest had turned against him, alive with something malevolent, something ancient. He looked around frantically, but there was nowhere to run. Every direction seemed to lead deeper into the darkness, into the heart of the woods, where shadows twisted and contorted into shapes he couldn't comprehend. And then he saw it again. The figure. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching him. Its shape was distorted like it was made of shadows. Its arms stretched out, reaching toward him, its mouth open wide. The whispers reached a crescendo, and the forest roared to life. The whispers were deafening, swirling around Stephen. He felt his sanity slipping as the forest pressed in. The trees seemed to reach out to ensnare him. The figure moved, its form bending like smoke, its limbs stretched far, distorting the air. The darkness around it felt like a heavy cloak. Stephen. The voice called again, echoing in his mind. It felt like a thought he couldn't escape. The figure stepped closer, the ground twisting beneath its feet. The air hummed, vibrating in his chest. The forest's frequency had shifted. Please. Stephen whispered, his voice lost in fear. What are you? What do you want? The figure didn't answer. It reached out, its fingers scraping against a tree. The sound was like metal on stone, chilling him to the bone. Stephen stumbled back, his mind in chaos. His hunting weapon felt useless against the creature. He was paralyzed by fear. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. They seemed to come from everywhere. The forest was alive with voices. And then, for a moment, Stephen understood. This wasn't just one creature. It was the forest itself. The trees, earth, and darkness were alive. It was ancient, older than he could comprehend. The creature was its guardian, feeding on the souls of those who wandered too deep. Stephen was its latest prey. He felt his mind unraveling. The whispers crashed over him, dragging him deeper into madness. There was no escape. The figure was almost upon him, its limbs stretching out. For the first time, Stephen felt a deep sense of finality. The creature would never let him leave. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping instantly. His breath came out in ragged gasps. He could hear leaves rustling in the distance, but it wasn't the wind, and then, as the figure closed the distance, its form looming over him, Stephen's mind snapped. The isolation, dread, and endless whispers tore at his sanity. He screamed, but the scream was swallowed by the forest. The next morning the forest was silent again. The wind stirred the leaves softly. The sun broke through the clouds, casting the woods in a dull gray light. Everything seemed normal and peaceful, but there was something missing. The cabin, once filled with signs of life, was now still. No footprints or signs of Stephen's presence were left. It was as if he had never been there. A strange peace hung in the air. The forest seemed to have settled back into its quiet slumber, and the creature, it was gone, but not truly gone. The forest knew it would wait. It would wait for the next soul to wander too far into its secrets. The forest would wait for the next disturbance, the next offering to its endless hunger, and when the time came it would rise again. The whispers never truly stopped, they just faded into the wind, carried on the breeze that stirred the trees in a rhythm all its own, like a lullaby for the lost. A strange peace hung in the air, as if the forest had settled back into its quiet slumber. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the last echoes of a presence unseen, and the creature, it was gone. But not truly gone. Stephen staggered forward, his breath ragged, his limbs numb with exhaustion. His thoughts were a haze, his mind teetering on the edge of reason. He had made it. He had survived. The safety of the main trail was just ahead, the dim glow of dawn creeping through the trees. Civilization was near. Yet, as he took another step, the air thickened. The forest did not release him. His foot sank, not into dirt, but into something deeper, something wrong. His heartbeat hammered as he looked down. The ground beneath him was shifting. Roots coiled around his boots like grasping fingers, dragging him downward. His scream barely left his lips before the earth swallowed it whole. The last thing Stephen saw was the sky vanishing, the sliver of light above devoured by the blackness beneath. The forest did not let go. It never had. Somewhere deep within the woods, the whispers continued. The wind carried them in a rhythm all its own, a lullaby for the lost. And soon the forest would wait again. The next hunter, the next fool, the cycle would begin again.